Um, I attempted to be a doctor, failed miserably at that within the first 6 months. So it hasn't all been smooth sailing, that's for sure. And it was a friend of mine who suggested to me that I should go and have a look at what they were doing in psychology, and it was around forensics, and absolutely and instantly fell in love with it. And then I worked out that I wanted to be a clinical psychologist, which unfortunately, universities only really take 8 of us a year. So it's pretty tough to get into. In fact, I failed getting into that 2 times in a row. Before on my third go, I was lucky enough to get accepted into a couple of universities, and we ended up in Waikato, and lived in Hamilton for a little bit, and then moved to Cambridge, where we reside now. So I did my 3 years of clinical training, and then worked in corrections and forensics, which had been the dream for quite a while, ever since pretty much those first lectures, and thoroughly enjoyed it. Until sport became a little bit more my scene, and felt like I needed to go somewhere else and grow. And I played sport my entire life, so it just seemed absolutely fitting that I try it. Started off at a whole lot of volunteer work with different clubs, rugby clubs, even though my sport that I am pretty passionate about is football, and I've played that in my entire life. But that's where I started, was in rugby. And then it was in 2000, end of 2016, started 2017, I got my big break where I got contracted to High Performance Sport, and started working with the Blackfern Sevens team, who I've been with for 5 years now. And we were very lucky. Well, I shouldn't say lucky, that's probably a bit of a minimization. The girls worked really hard, but we managed to get a gold medal at the end of it. And since then, I've finished with them, and I now take up an advisory role with New Zealand Rugby, especially in the wellbeing space, predominantly in mental health. Then I also work with the All Whites and the Football Ferns. So I've been with New Zealand Football for about 2 years now. And a big part of this year has been qualifying the All Whites for the World Cup. So hopefully we can get the business done in a couple of weeks' time. Well, actually a month's time. And outside of your work, I'm pretty typical Kiwi, where we've got, enjoy my sport, love being outdoors. And I've got a wife, been married for about 11 years, and we've got 3 children. So we've got a 6-year-old Sienna, a 4-year-old Theo, and a 1-year-old Lucia. So it's a pretty busy house, and so I know a little bit about parenting, but I know most of you are significantly a bit further on with a lot of teenagers and things like that. So hopefully some of my tips, they won't be coming from personal experience, they'll be coming a little bit more from experience working with adolescents and families, when I worked at Holder and mental health. But as well, like in sport and performance. So hopefully you get a bit more out of this talk, but that's me. And I'll tell you why in a moment, why I share a lot of that information about myself. But here's the presentation. And so I'll tell you how I'm going to lay it out in a moment. But really our main focus is on promoting a positive mindset, and kind of the ways that I typically try and do that with a lot of athletes around their performance. But the first kind of story, again, that I'll tell you a little bit about is, there's this picture here, which I actually put up about 4 years ago when I did a talk for ACC. It says that the football field is where all of life's problems disappear for 90 minutes. And for me personally, I've got an absolute loving family and father and mother. But to be honest, the football field is where problems all sort of started for 90 minutes. And my dad was pretty critical of how I played. And it wouldn't last just on the football pitch. It would kind of be for 1 to 2 days after, whereas if I didn't perform well enough, I wouldn't get spoken to for about a day. And it was actually the same with exams. If I didn't score over 85%, then I wouldn't really necessarily get spoken to. So it was it felt like at that stage, quite a conditional love. I've learned a lot since then, that perhaps the way that I've perceived things was a little bit different to the reality. But regardless, that was my perception of having quite a highly critical father, and growing up with that, and kind of sometimes what that's left me with quite a lot of self-doubt. And I still notice it even now. It's just that I learn when I want to turn the volume up, when I want that to really help drive me, but also when do I turn the volume down a little bit, and I need to be a little bit more self-compassionate with myself. But hopefully today you'll learn some strategies as to how to help that, both for you guys as students, as teenagers, young adults, but also for you guys as parents, and hopefully today provide a bit of a foundation in some ways for you both to start talking about that, because it's only something now in my 30s that I'm starting to talk to my families about, my parents about, and getting the courage to do that, but also trying to implement a lot of that stuff with my own family. And partly that's hard because having critical parents, sometimes it lends itself to then be quite mellow and relaxed about a lot of things. And actually it's not quite black and white like that. There's a gray area. So I know that I will be speaking to people that already know a lot of the stuff. Typically people that attend these things are actually quite good at it, but hopefully I can promote quite a lot of conversation around it as well. So when it comes to performance, which I probably spend most of my time talking about opposed to mental health stuff, but when it comes to performance, what people typically look at is they'll look at, this was the situation that happened. This is how I behaved in that particular situation, and my behavior is what led to my performance. Now, when I talk about performance, I want to be mindful here that I'm not just talking about sports performance. I'm talking about performance in life. So for you guys as parents, it's about our performances as a mother or a father. For students, young adults, you guys, it's about performance in the classroom. It's about performance on the football pitch, swimming pool, whatever that is. I'm lucky enough to work with surgeons and anaesthetists and teams of that, and still they're performing. I've been lucky enough to work with ballerinas, musicians as well. For them, that is still performance. But this is what we typically look at. Now, my thing is what drives the behavior. Start asking more questions around, which is the typical psychologist question, is how does that make you feel? Which is a bit of a loaded question. I don't particularly like that myself, but it's the feelings that will drive the behavior. But what drives the feelings is the way that we think, and it's our attitude. And where those thoughts come from, they come from your beliefs that you have about yourself and about others and about the world and how it all works. And then where our beliefs come from are our past experiences. Okay, and that's typically what starts to shape your identity and who you are down below there. And so that's why I do often start by talking a little bit about who I am and where I'm from. And I think last time I probably went into a little bit more detail, but those past experiences and understanding that part help me understand how I see the world and how I see myself, which impacts the way that I think in any given situation, which can eventually influence my performance, whether it's my performance as a psych or even my performance as a dad. So the better question to ask ourselves, for you guys as young adults or for parents, is rather than what do you want to be when you grow up? Right? Actually, another question is how do you want to be? But the other part is for parents is how do you want your child to think and feel about themselves when they leave school? Because that will automatically influence their behaviors. And for you guys as young adults is how do you want to think and feel about yourself by the time that you leave school? Okay, rather than thinking about what is it that exactly I want to do, just think about how do you want to think about yourself. So it's a little bit of a rhetorical question that I'll put to you at the moment. Okay, so a lot of my work that I do with people, yes, I go into like their past and things like that, the typical psychologist thing, but I'm really interested in any given moment. What were your thoughts in that moment? Okay, so if I'm talking to a footballer, for example, yes, I'll see that particular situation in the field, but I want to understand how they thought about it, how they saw it, where did they focus? Okay, so I know that it will influence the rest of this. With coaches that I work with, rather than me talking about their behavior all the time, I want to understand, well, did you ask the player, how did they think in that particular situation? Okay, and so this is my model of how I sort of work and how I help develop a positive mindset, or kind of what I prefer as an optimistic mindset. I think sometimes if we go down the positive route a bit too much, excuse my English, but if we keep on thinking positively, we end up in a bit of a bullshit world. And sometimes things are just crap, are really hard. So actually we need to have a little bit more optimism than positivity. I won't tell you the story about mountains, I'll leave that for another time. But what I want you to understand is that there's a difference between performance or sports psychology and mental skills. So people typically get these thinking that these are the same thing. Performance psychology and sports psychology is much more about how you understand yourself to be. What are your values? Where are you from? What do you connect to? What are your fears, your anxieties? It's that deeper stuff, that deeper entrenched work. Whereas the mental skills, which is what a lot of people come to my office and ask about, is teach me how to be really confident. So give me some visualization techniques. Teach me to get rid of anxiety. So teach me some breathing techniques. They're all well and good and they will help performance, but not as deeply as actually understanding yourself. And I'll get to that in a moment. And then sitting on top of that is I use adversity training. So this is when I get creative with coaches a lot more. I go, how can we increase the players or the person's ability to think in that moment? How do we increase fatigue? So they've got to try and use those mental skills under fatigue like they would as if they were playing an Olympic final. But just to make it even more simple for people, try not to get things too complicated, but just simply the bottom layer and the foundation for good psychology, my opinion, is how do you understand yourself? So understand me first, then what are the skills that I need to be me? And then how do I stay myself under immense amount of pressure? Okay, so understand me, be me, stay me is the model. And what I find is that more that I work through this with people, performance will definitely improve, but especially in high performance should be defined by consistency, sorry. So when you go through this, the performance improves on a much more consistent basis. But if you're just simply having athletes and people focus on the mental skills or the be me part, we don't typically see the consistency. And we get improvement, but not as consistent as actually people going deeper into understanding themselves. And that's really important for teenagers, because as your stages of development go between the ages of 16 and 21 approximately, there's a whole identity phase there. Okay, so actually focusing too much on this stuff here is actually not going to be that helpful in the long term. And ultimately for me, performance is about authentic and genuine self-expression. It's absolutely completely letting go and being able to express yourself on the field, in the pool, in the music stages and things like that, whatever your performance may be. And so this is how I framed up tonight. So we'll first start with how it relates to the model. So understand me, be me, stay me. Then I'll have a few talking points and go into a bit more depth. Provide you guys with some practical tips, because I often know that when we come into these types of talks, like psychs, we can tend to talk a lot about theory and that, rather than actually giving you something to go away with. So I wanted to make sure that that was really relevant for you. And then after the practical tips, I'm just going to give you within whoever's around your screen, just an opportunity just to chat amongst yourselves on what's being presented. And if you're by yourself, that's absolutely fine. Maybe that's just an opportunity for you to reflect and write some notes as well. So that's kind of how I'll go through it. And then when I've gone through this, I'll come back and we'll do the be me part and go through the same, and then finish this, go back through the stay me part. So the first bit, understand me and performance psychology. And so just a reminder as well, if you do have any questions along the way, just throw them in the chat, and there'll be an opportunity and a couple of points for me to stop in and answer those. So what I'm going to talk about here is a bit about stress and pressure, and what I've termed red and green mind states, which is actually not too different in actual fact. And I don't claim to come up with any of this myself. There's much smarter people than me, like Kerry Evans, who's absolutely brilliant. People like David Galbraith, and scientists who have talked about things like, if you're really onto it, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So it's just the language that I use, but there are better people out there that have come up with this stuff. I just changed the language to make sense for me. Well, what I want you to do now is just take some time just to watch this particular clip and just think about what would it be like to know absolutely nothing about yourself. So if I try and convince people, typically you need to know a lot about yourself to help performance. I've tried to flip this more recently just to think about what would it be like to know nothing about yourself. I think this is where we kind of got to last time before I interrupted everyone. So watch the clip. It's about a guy that has a seizure, and then he wakes up and he knows absolutely nothing about himself, and you hear him being interviewed. So just pay attention to the words that he uses, the emotions, even the way his body language is. Just think about some of that, okay? And okay, I'll keep on going. There you go.
No memory prior to that. My first memory is waking up in Denver outside of the World Trade Center. It was early in the morning. I'm not sure at what time. It looked like the sun was just starting to come up, so there's some light there. I was half picking myself up off of the ground, and I had no idea where I was. I didn't recognize no buildings, no streets, no nothing. I couldn't even remember my name. So I thought, okay, maybe I have a wallet. There's no ID on me at all. And I looked like frantically for something that could say, okay, this is who I am, call for help. But I didn't have anything. And it was extremely, extremely terrifying. They turned me away as if I was, someone that lives off of the streets or was some kind of a psychotic person, like, yeah, like you don't know where you are kind of thing. But that just gave me more focus on to find a hospital where I knew I could get care. I walked for 6 to 8 hours until I found one. And I ended up walking into Denver Health. Walked up to where they take the admissions and stuff like that, and said I need help. They go, okay, well, what is your name? I said, I have no idea. That's what I'm here for. She says, well, you got to put something down. I said, I don't know my name. Like, you guys don't understand. So they just gave me a name and stuff there. John Doe. Still drilled me. What's your name? I said, I don't know. And I'm in tears at this time. I'm shaking really, really bad. I can barely stand up. So they asked me to empty out my pockets and everything. And then I went into a psych room, and then they had me talk to a psychiatrist and stuff and nurses in there. And they didn't know what to believe. Like cases like this do not come around very often. It's probably the most frustrating thing that person can ever go through, is to lose their identity. Because your past is what makes you who you are today, good or bad. For me, I go through my intuition because I don't have any memories coming back. But me being here, I know I'm in the right place. Here is home. Home is with her.
Okay, so I successfully managed to get through the video, which I'm patting myself on the back. But just to think about what was some of the feelings, some of the thoughts, some of the language he was using during that video, and I appreciate it is probably a bit faint for some of you, so I'm sorry about that. So I'm just going to give you 1 minute just to reflect with the person next to you, or just with yourself. Just what were a couple of the things that you started to notice? Okay, I'll come back. So I think some of the things is he talks about, frustration, some anxiety, but there's some key elements there where he talks about to lose your identity is one of the scariest things that could possibly happen. He says that towards the end. And the past makes who we are today, good or bad. So sometimes it's not always reflecting on, the good parts of, who we are and the good beliefs, but actually trying to understand and acknowledge and accept some of the, I wouldn't use the word bad, I'd typically use the word unhelpful, the unhelpful parts of our past as well. And the main emotion that sits in there a lot of the time is fear. And in a lot of athletes and a lot of performers and a lot of us, it's the fear that actually stops us from performing. So I'm going to say here is if fear is the thing that halts self-expression, and being able to express ourselves is key to performance, what do you think the goal is for performance psychology? And how people will typically answer that is they'll say it's about having no fear, absolutely no fear whatsoever. And so people are constantly talking to me. And you even hear it in coaches, like, I want our team to be fearless. And it's actually not about being fearless. It's actually about being fearing less, or what I've put here, which is about knowing fear and actually spending some time understanding it and exploring it. But so many people don't want to go there. But typically in the best performers that I tend to work with, who are performing at their best for long periods of time, they're more than willing to explore the things that scare the living daylights out of them. They're more than willing to start to ask themselves the question. And so that's when I really started focusing on a little bit more about this understanding about stress and pressure, because typically if I asked all of you, when you hear the word stress and pressure, what words start to come up to mind? People talk about, weight on my shoulders, expectation. Basically, they all have negative connotations. And when stress and pressure is seen as a negative thing, people want to get rid of it. They want to run away. They want to avoid it. They want it out of their lives. But there's actually two types of stress. There's distress, which is the unhelpful stress, but there's also eustress, the stress that's really helpful for us, and we need it to perform. Okay, so I tell a lot of performers that actually you need it in your life. You need to understand the fear. You need a bit of fear in your life to be able to perform at your absolute best. But it's when that fear becomes really unhelpful and it's seen as a perceived threat to your identity. So it's when people typically are worried about their self-image, their self-worth, and their self-esteem, and then they start to tell themselves a story in that moment about what that means for them. Okay, and it's like that their performance solely determines how they will feel about themselves, when that's not helpful whatsoever. So actually understanding your identity, not just as, say, for example, a footballer, but also understanding yourself as a brother, a sister, for some of us, a father, uncle, cousin, academic, musician, whatever it is, that becomes really important, because then the story that we tell ourselves isn't pressured purely on, getting the potential free kick or the penalty at that particular time. And so what happens typically to people when they see pressure or stress as a negative thing and it's a threat to their self-worth, they start to become distracted inside their minds. And so I'll talk about this particular part in a little bit more detail. Okay, so they become distracted. So the fear started to get them. Okay, then what they do is they go into the me, where they only really start thinking about themselves. Okay, and you can see this out on the sports pitch a lot of the time, where people stop passing to each other, they go into their shells a little bit more, they start playing safe. And then what happens when they start doing that for a long period of time is we have a bit of a victim mindset, which becomes, poor me, I'm not good enough, I don't deserve to be here, which we all have, but we also have the ability to turn the volume down, as I talked before. Okay, and then once we get stuck in that loop, it's very difficult to get out. Now, most people will get distracted. That's an absolute given. Okay, and what I'd want to propose here is that red mind isn't bad, and green mind, which I'll talk about in a moment, is good. Okay, these are just attention states and focus states. Okay, so it's okay to get distracted from time to time. That's going to happen. Everybody has it. But it's when we get caught in that loop, it becomes really unhelpful to our performance. Oh. And so in the red mind, we're riddled with fear, and we protect ourselves by typically putting a mask on. Performing well is about expressing yourself and experience ways to turn the volume of fear down, just as I talked about before. So, a lot of the time people do three things, which I'll talk about in a moment, actually. They put the mask on. But typically what masks look like for a lot of people is that fear of judgment, the fear of status, fear of failure, fear of expectation. Sorry, I'll go back to the fear of status because that can be confusing. So that's when you start comparing yourself to other people. And typically what we do when we compare ourselves to other people is we put them up on a pedestal, which means we put ourselves down quite a lot lower. We tend to look at all their successes and things that they're really good at, but look at all our own weaknesses. The fear of uncertainty, which is really common during COVID and lockdown times and still is at the moment. And the fear of isolation, being by ourselves, not being accepted, not feeling like we belong. So what typically happens when people experience this is they put a mask on and they try and protect themselves. So for me, going to school, I was quite an anxious kid because I was so worried about what people were going to think of me, including my parents, but just generally all my peers. And what I did is I put a mask on. And the thing that I did was one of these three things here, which was I tended to overcompensate. And what that can typically look like is that can look like turning around and being a bit of the macho person, being a bit too cool for school, okay, to overcompensate for the anxiety that you're feeling. Other things that people do is they shift responsibility and they blame other people or other situations or other things. Or some of us also surrender. So we give in to the thought, I'm not good enough. So therefore, I'm going to behave in a way that's not good enough. I often see this in relationships when I do relationship work. As a person that thinks they're not good enough, they often get themselves into a relationship with someone that makes them feel not good enough. Okay, so in sports and in performance, I often talk about this as putting the white flag up and doing SOS. And so some of these behaviors look really different. So overcompensate isn't always just about being macho. I notice this in a few athletes where they over-prepare, well over-prepare for a match. Or typically, if I'm presenting, you see me present again, and I'm not sure, I'm feeling anxious, I'll overcompensate by putting way too many words on the page. So I can just read through the whole thing rather than talking from experience. Okay, so these are the three behaviors that we typically see in a lot of performers when they're in that red mind, when they're not paying attention to the things that are important, okay, and they're behaving in a way that's not aligned with their values, which I'll talk about again soon. opposed to green mind. So what people typically do when they're in the green mind is they will be a bit more flexible in the way that they think rather than getting stuck into a circle. And so they'll either do three things. They'll connect back to what's important, which is like their values, their identity, and their teammates. They'll know the right times to be able to bring a little bit of edge into a particular moment. So that's that real competitive grit that I'm going to win no matter what cost. But too much edge brings not a much, doesn't bring focus. Okay, so if we're bringing too much edge, then we lose focus on the things that are important. And so being in green mind is about going, what do I need right at this moment? So to a couple of the All Whites leaders, as an example, like I'm trying to get them to sit back in particular moments where there's a little bit of stoppage in play and go, what's happening with our team at the moment? Are we too edgy? So do we need to connect back to what's important to us? Okay, or we're far too worried about like connection. Actually, we need a bit of like grit and grind, and we need to show a bit of edge and a bit of courage to absolutely go into a massive tackle. Okay, and so I typically find that I can mold this depending on the individual that I'm working at, depending on what they're performing in. But what I'm trying to say here is people in green mind, when they're performing well, they're a lot more flexible in the way that they're thinking, whereas in red mind, they're a lot more stuck. So what the behaviors I typically see is people can adapt under pressure, so they can change what they're doing really quickly. They show courage, which I'll talk about in more detail in a couple of slides, and they're much more trustworthy of their teammates or the people around them, or even themselves. Okay, so they tend to act, they're moving towards stress and pressure because they know that pressure is a bit of a privilege. Okay, so that's the difference between red mind and green mind. And so for students, some of these practical tips for young adults is rather than running away from pressure and stress a lot of the time, try and invite it into your life a little bit more and just see how you actually start to operate when you've got some stress. So start to see stress as a good thing, okay, or something that can really help your performance. Okay, because it's not all bad. So invite it in, especially if you're performing on the field or something like that. Like that's one of the best things that you can possibly do. You need it to grow a little bit. Okay, but always thinking about how do I learn more about myself in the red and the green ones. This is the identity piece. So understand what triggers you to be in the green, or what triggers you and helps you be in the red, or forces you into the red, sorry. What do you think like? Where does your mind go? How do you start to behave in each of those? And even if you start to do and just draw out that little red and that green and just start talking about that with yourself and reflecting on it, you'll start to understand a lot more about yourself and why you do things. Okay. And then for parents, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but it's very difficult at the same time. And I feel like I'm telling you to suck eggs a little bit here, but we really need to create an environment that will help your child or help the student learn more about themselves. And one way that you can do that, I'll just go down to that third point. I think a lot of the time I see a lot of parents and coaches, typically when someone's distressed or they're not doing so well, we want to give advice all the time. That's not what the other person wants to hear. And a lot of young people, they don't want to hear the advice. In fact, I'll give you a story. So I used to drive into Hamilton. So it's like a 20-30 minute drive from Cambridge, pick my wife up. We used to drive back together, and she was having a good moan about her school, which the school will remain nameless. And so I was in typical psychologist mode because I'd still finished the day of work. So I was trying to give her as much advice as possible. And she told me to shut up, basically. And she said, stop giving me advice, stop being a psychologist and just be my bloody husband. So, all right. So for the next 2 months, I kid you not, I just sat back, I listened. And then she turned around and said, when are you going to start giving me some bloody advice? So I had no idea where I was at. But the key thing there was just understanding what is it that she needs at that particular time. Sometimes she just needed support. Sometimes she needed advice, and probably less likely she needed a bit of challenge. But that's one of the things I'll ask a lot of people who come into my office is, what do you need from me today? Are you searching for some advice? Do you actually just need me to support you in what you're doing? Or do you need me to challenge the way that you're thinking, you're doing things? And that sets up the expectation. And for parents to be able to do that with their kids, I think it's a great way of setting the scene a little bit more. Which helps create an environment that's a bit more helpful for them to learn more about themselves and giving them the opportunity to try and work through things. And if anything else, just keep building your relationship with your kids as much as you possibly can. And Carl Rogers, a psychologist, this is from like 1954 and it's still relevant. He talks about 3 things to build that environment, which is congruence. So be really aligned as to where you're wanting to go. That's why I say is get a clear picture of not what you want your kids to be, but what do you want them to think and feel about themselves. So know where you're both going. have that empathy. So it's just actually trying to understand rather than giving advice, just aim to understand as much as you possibly can. And then the unconditional positive regard. So it's just thinking about, how often do I give them that great feedback when they do really well versus negative feedback when they don't do so well. It's often thinking about, and I will give some more advice around the conditional positive regard stuff as well, around how you can frame that up a little bit so you're not just doing it when they're doing really well or when they're not doing so well. Okay, so just some practical tips for you guys just to start to think about. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 2 minutes just to talk to the person next to you or just reflect on a couple of those things that I've already started to speak about. Okay, so 2 minutes. So I see it's 7:34. I'll bring it back in at 7:36. So have that time in that moment just to chat. And if you've got any questions, just pop them up in the chat thing and I'll start looking at them. Oh, yeah. Even feel free. I'm part Italian, so I can talk really fast as well. So even if there's in the chat you say, Dom, can you just speak a bit slower as well? Because I get bloody excited by this stuff. So just feel free to give me feedback as to talk slower or something as well.
Can you see the question at the bottom, Dom?
Yeah, I'm going to answer it as soon as we come back in. Okay, I'm going to bring us back in. So, okay, cool. There's a couple of questions coming in. Great. So the first one I saw on the Q&A, which was, is my practice informed by cognitive behavioral psychology? So yes, in part. So my training was a CBT-based training, which stands for cognitive behavior therapy. But I kind of switched between 3 different types of psychology practice. So there's cognitive behavioral psychology, there's ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. And simply because cognitive behavior therapy is about challenging the way that you think, but sometimes you just can't challenge the way that you think. Like I said before, sometimes things just aren't great. And it's learning to accept as much as you possibly can and commit with valued action, which is typically the approach around ACT. So I particularly like that in sport because there's so much that you can't control. So I'll talk a lot about values, and I'm going to do it in the next section as well. And then the last one, which people don't know as much about, which is schema therapy. And so schema is understanding like about your core beliefs and how it causes you to act. And that's actually where the SOS and the ACT part really comes from, especially the SOS, where people use unhelpful, what they call maladaptive ways to cope with particular situations. I've just slightly changed the wording a little bit. So yes, it is. I hope that's answered that question. I'm going to go to the chat. So I just need to use, I'll use a few more practical explanations. And I'm going to come back to that second one after the next break, because then I can have a little bit more time to actually read it. Because what people don't know about me is I actually can't read very well. So uni was a huge challenge where I can read, but to be able to understand, my comprehension is low. So if anybody used to do PAT tests, to give you an example, I used to sit and score around 23 to 25% most of the time. So it's something that people don't really know too much about me, and they make the assumption that I'm a good reader and a fast reader. So I'm just going to come back to this, and then I can see there's a few more questions popping up as well. So I'd rather spend time reading that when you go into your next chat room and answer correctly. Okay, so just shifting up from the understand me part. So again, I can't give you everything tonight, but if I can at least get you starting to talk about your red mind and your green mind, your behaviors and understanding the way that you think, then you're on the right course for understanding yourself. So this is the mental skills part. Now, there are so many different mental skills that I could have gone with here. Like typical ones will be like your mindfulness, meditation, visualization, breathing techniques, progressive muscle relaxation, pre-match preparation, which I think comes back to that other question a little bit. But the one I really wanted to nail and speak about was around focus, because I think it's probably the most common question that comes up is, how do I focus more? And so I've got these 3 areas that I'll focus on, which is focus, cake, and courage. So I know cake sounds a little bit silly, but it will make sense in a moment. And hopefully there's some good practical examples within this as well. So the key thing here, like I said, the most common question is, how do I have more focus? But you only have a limited amount of focus. You actually can't get more of it. You just decide and choose where you put your focus. So for a lot of people, when they're not performing well, they tend to shift their focus onto things that they can't control, or the uncontrollables, and spend very little time on the things that they can control. And in fact, we know that when you spend more time either multitasking, which is not a thing, that's been proven wrong so many times in the literature. So if you think you multitask, we don't do 2 things at the same time. We actually shift between tasks very quickly. And when you do that, you actually decrease your performance by 40% because the brain's got to go back and forth. And that's typically what's happening when we're only looking at the uncontrollables. And it also causes a significant decrease in motivation. So focusing on the wrong things will cause a decrease in your motivation. And the wrong things, what I mean by the wrong things, are the things that you cannot control. They are not helpful whatsoever. So what we need to be doing is focusing as much as we possibly can on the controllables, which a lot of you may have heard the saying of like, control the controllables. And so this is where my food-loving self always tries to find an analogy around, cake or pizza or something like that. But clearly what I want you to know is that your focus, where you put your focus and your attention, it will impact your performance. Now, typically people love cake. Most people love cake. They especially love cake with icing on it because it makes a crappy cake taste better. It's sweeter. It makes a cake look better, right? And so typically what people are chasing a lot of the time in performance is they're wanting the icing as much as you possibly can. Rather than what I talk to people about is understanding what your ingredients are and chasing that, because cake still tastes bloody good even without the icing. It just tastes that little bit better with it. But what I find with a lot of performers and a lot of people is they're always chasing the icing. They're always chasing the thing that tastes sweet and gives them that kick, that little kick. But unfortunately, there are things that you can't control. So in sport, that can be things like goals. It can be winning. It can be like paychecks and contracts. It can be recognition from other people, the amount of likes you get on social media. You can't, in football, for example, you can't control the amount of goals that you score, because sometimes a goalkeeper is just bloody amazing. You can't control whether you win or not the majority of the time or 100% of the time, because sometimes the other team's just a little bit better. Or if you're in a judging situation, the judges, it's very subjective. Very rarely you can control your paycheck because someone else is paying that, or if you're a sole trader or what have you, it will go up and down depending on contracts that you have. You can't control how other people think, what they say, so recognition from others is not helpful. And your likes on social media, it's just the same thing as that 4th point. Okay, but so many people, they will base a lot of their success on those 5 things there, and some others on icing. What I try and help people really focus in on, which is the ingredients to their cake, which are the things that they can 100% control. And there's only very few of these. In fact, you could probably argue some of these with me. The things you can 100% control is your mindset and your attitude. It's your behavior and your work ethic. It's the values of the things that are important to you. It's your skill set and it's your choices. There's not much else in life that you can really 100% control. And the reality is if you focus on these things here and you do these things well, then you're much more likely going to get the icing. So if you go into a game, for example, with the right mindset and attitude, work really hard, you're values orientated, which I'll come to in a second with the courage part, you've worked on your skill set and you make good, helpful choices for yourself, the chances are you're probably going to get that icing anyway. But what I find is if this is a pattern for you, that over time your confidence goes up, down, great game, bad game, great game, bad game, whatever that may be, it's often because you're basing your success on the icing. So you get 10 goals in one game, you get no goals in the next. Your team wins the next game, they lose the next. You get 100 likes on social media, then no one responds whatsoever. Your coach says you're amazing, then he says nothing at all. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. Whereas what we typically find is when people base success and their focus on the ingredients, what we tend to find, yes, confidence will still go up and down, but it goes on a much even pathway. And what will happen is it slowly increases over time as well. Okay. So just something to think about, like, what am I focusing in on when I go into a game or when I go to perform? Am I focusing on winning? And this is the other part about, conditional love and unconditional love, is do you only give out the praise and the prizes and things like that when someone scores X amount of goals? Or are you basing some of that on whether they brought the right attitude into the particular game or whether they worked really hard? And so if I just go back here and I talk about this values thing, one of the values that I particularly try and push with people a little bit is the value of courage. So courage is the choice and willingness to confront agony, pain, danger, uncertainty, intimidation. Okay, so it is a choice. I'll tell you about this experiment here. So what they did is they wanted to know if there was a part in the brain, because we know there was a fear center in the brain called the amygdala. And what they basically did is they got a whole lot of people who were scared of snakes. So sitting on top of that white box is a massive python. Well, I don't know if it's python, I just made that up, but it's a snake anyway. And what they did is they put people in this functional MRI and to see what brain activity happened when the snake got closer and closer to their head. But what they did is they gave them a clicker and they were allowed to click the button. And every time they clicked the button, the snake would get closer and closer to their head. So an act of courage was when they brought the snake closer to their head. Whereas people that basically didn't press the button whatsoever, they were, in their ruthless words, were cowards. And so what they found is everybody, the amygdala lit up, but the people that pressed the button more and more, that the amygdala, the fear center, started to slowly shrink down. Okay, and what it did is then there was a part in the brain called the SGACC that started to light up. Okay, and that's responsible for controlling fear, emotion, stress, their perceptions, and a variety of other things. Okay, so what they found and what they started to propose is that there's a courage center in the brain. The interesting part, what they did then, is they split the group into two. But the people that were courageous, that brought the snake closer to their head and had significant more action in the SGACC, and the other group, which they named cowards. Sorry again for the ruthless language. And then they put them through a variety of different tasks. And what they found is that the people that were put in the courage group unanimously had improved self-efficacy. So they had more confidence in their ability to cope with pressure situations. They were faster learners on particular tasks. They were more determined on tasks. They adapted faster. Another particular task, they showed more resilience. On mindfulness apps and things like that, they were much more present focused, and they improved their performance at a faster rate. Now that was, bear in mind that improved performance was on simple like attention tasks and decision-making tasks. So there wasn't like going out and playing football or sport or anything like that. But in terms, that's what they concluded. So courage is not only a value in a word, but it starts to have, and there's other research as well, it starts to have some backing towards performance. So that's typically why I start to use it with people. And so if I'm working with someone, so this is the practical side of values that I quite enjoy. So this is a real life example of something that I did with a footballer a few years back now. As I talked through like what values, what things are really important to them in life, and you see that courage one. And so then I said, well, what does that, because at the moment that's just a word, what does that look like if I was going to come and watch you play football? Like, how would I know that you're showing courage? And this is what she started to write down, is I put my line on the body for tackles, aerial for headers, blah, 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 etc., etc. But then also the other part that we wanted to do is, what does that look like in your life? Because for me, the brain doesn't necessarily realize when it's under stress, the situation, doesn't realize whether you're playing a game of football, rugby, performing on a stage, operating in surgery versus in life. It's still physiologically will do it, it still presents the same. So what we wanted to do is create habits in every little area of your life or in anyone's life so that it doesn't know no different. And so this is a practical application, I guess, of values work, where you're starting to look at particular behaviors that they have. And I don't know if I say it later, but I'll say it now just in case I forget. When a player, say for example in football, goes into a warm up or into a match or into training, I'll often ask them what's their focus, and they'll say my focus. If they've worked with me, they'll say I'm working on my value of courage, and this is what it's going to look like for me in training today. So I know exactly what it is, and there's a lot of intent and goal setting around their what they're trying to achieve, what their intent is, and also how it links to a value that's actually important to them. Okay, so some practical tips for students and parents. So just be values-based and standards-driven. So I do really encourage you to think about what values are really important to you and actually where do they come from. But practically as well, like set your daily or weekly intentions based on your values. So like those behaviors that I showed you, is even in your diaries, you can say, in fact, this value is important to me, so it might be courage. This is what I'm going to focus on in terms of my behavior today or this week. And you might have a couple of them and then you tick them off as you go along. Okay, because there is a part in the brain as well in terms of motivation that's motivated more so by values than actually in terms of the long term rather than extrinsic things. And then base your success and your reflection on your ingredients. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail with that third part a bit later about how you reflect around your values and will help build your positive mindset. So parents, again, one of the things that you can do is actually have some really clear family values. That's a really good way to start. So our family values might even be kindness, it might be gratitude, it might be courage, it might be hard work. But again, defining, well, what does that look like? And so what you can do, rather than rewarding based on or having conversations on, say, goals scored, their mark that they got in their exam, actually try and reward it based on your family values. And the other part to that is encourage ways of problem solving, not problem finding. So a lot of the time when we come into these conversations, we're talking about values and we're talking about focus. Often we spend a lot more time focusing on like the problem. So see if you can actually get the kids to spend more time focusing on solving the problem, but not you solving the problem. It's just asking them little questions about, well, how would you do that? If you did this way, well, how would you do it differently next time? Okay. So again, like they're more about conversation starters, which become really important. Okay. So again, I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes. Well, shivers, I can see the time. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to talk about it, chat about it a bit more. And I'm going to have a look at some of these questions again. So just reflect on what you've heard me talk about already around some of the mental skills and where you put your focus. Put your focus on things that you can control. Have them values-based where you can. And even think about your sport or whatever it is that you're performing and go, where are the opportunities to quickly reflect? I'll give you 2 minutes. Okay, I'll bring you back in. I'm mindful of the time. What I'm going to do is I'll answer a couple of these and I'm going to come back to some of them. The sleep one, if you want to stay on for a little bit longer afterwards, I'll spend that time doing that, because that could be potentially a long answer. In terms of the motivation, that is a tough one. A lot of parents get really frustrated about how do I motivate them. I guess the hard part with me also says, what are you doing, or what are some people doing to almost like spoon feed them a little bit? So sometimes when that question's asked, what I notice in some people is that they're giving them a lot of stuff and there's a lot of external reward. Whereas what we need to do is we create an environment which maybe fits into the environmental question as well, where the support and the challenge needs to be really balanced. So it's like understanding when are the right times to support and help them out, but when's the other times where I need to challenge them and actually ask them questions so that they come up with the answers, rather than me always having to come up with the answers. And the other part around motivation is asking ourselves, one, the first hard question, which is like, is this my dream or their dream to get them motivated to do this? When is the times I actually need to sit back? But there needs to be some sort of autonomy and control in their lives as well. So helping them learn how to make decisions for themselves, or actually really getting an understanding of what their big dreams are and how they're going to get there, and even setting out some of the plan on a day-to-day basis can really help. So we'll talk about that in a moment, which could help with that motivational question. Do I encourage reflection evaluation of developing and displaying the values? Yes, 100%. I'm going to come back to that in the next section as well. I think I've got most of those. If I haven't answered them to your liking, please come back. Please come back to me. All right. Yeah. So the STAMI parts, this is always quite interesting, and I didn't necessarily know 100% how I've framed this up, but this is really what we call the adversity training, and I use a thing called the fear or the courage hierarchy. And I'm also going to talk about then, once that's set up, which is what's going to help a bit with the motivation, because we need that bit of challenge. Like I said, there needs to be the balance between challenge and support. So the fear hierarchy sets up the challenges. Then we need to really reinforce the positives, even though that's a blimmin' hard thing to do. And then helping people learn how to reflect in a way that's actually really helpful. So fear hierarchy is kind of like setting up a little bit of a ladder. And I think about, like, if I'm treating people with specific phobias, so it could be like a phobia of like talking in front of people, of heights, needles, spiders. What I'm trying to do is, after teaching them like some relaxation skills and understanding them and I'm trying to go, if it's a spider that they're really scared of, I'll start with something that's quite small, gives them a fear of like a 1 out of 10, for example, which could be simply drawing a spider, and that promotes like that physical anxiety response. And then breathe and bring it back down. Then what they'll do is, there might be a toy spider, might be like 3 out of 10. So that might sit in the corner of the room, and they've got to breathe, bring themselves back down to it. Then it'll get closer and closer, and then we bring a real spider in until they're holding on their hands, which is their 10 out of 10 fear. So what you're doing is you're slowly exposing yourself to the fear of the thing that you're scared of, which is what we do in clinical phobia work. It's called systematic desensitization, if you really want to know that word. But what we're doing a lot of the time is performance is, like I said before with the mask, there's fear of making mistakes, fear of coach feedback, all those things that I've written down there. So when I'm really trying to understand with the performers, what is the fear and what does that start to look like at level 1? Then what does it look like at level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5? So a really good example that I had of a Sevens player, who I'll keep nameless, is the fear of making mistakes, which led to letting people down and letting my teammates down. So she would simply start of like making mistakes actually on purpose. So we called them intentional failing sessions. And that would just happen at training, not even close to selection times. So she'd make small little mistakes, whether it be dropping the ball. And then 10 out of 10 was literally dropping the ball in the final of a World Series match. So trying to do things that don't ruin people's integrity, I'd never do that. And it's obviously got to be agreed upon with that person. But that's where we got to. In fact, actually, no, she went to dropping the ball 3 times in a row. And the whole, so it was a behavioral experiment, really. Like, what would I feel? Can I get myself refocused on the things that are important? Can I breathe to bring down my physiological arousal? So we're doing things like that. And obviously the reflection becomes an important part of it. So in terms of the STAMI, the advice that I can give is, what are the challenges that you're setting yourself that are increasing fear a little bit? And then you're trying to overcome them. So you slowly, so don't go from like a 1 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10. That would be silly. That would not be helpful one little bit. But it's thinking about what are those small stages that I can make that are really halting my performance a little bit. So if it's any one of those things, start coming up with some particular things. Okay, that's where you can get creative. And yeah. And so yeah, this is a silly question. How do you eat an elephant? Now, typically what people say, they go, I can't eat a bloody elephant. But it's simply the way that you're in one sitting, because that's the assumption that we make. But really what we're doing is we're trying to just take one bite at a time, and eventually you get through it. And so this is what I'm saying in terms of, the motivation is actually sitting down and building a bit of a strategic plan. I think too many people think about, this is where I want to go and this is what I want to get to, but they don't actually build a plan around it. And this is including like top athletes that I'm lucky enough to work with. They will not build a plan around it. They'll go, oh, I want to be an 80 cap all white, or I want to get to the Olympics, but there's actually no plan at all. So what I would suggest is that you as a young adult, block out 1 or 2 hours over the next week and really start to write a bit of a plan to achieve what I call like an impossible dream. I don't particularly like SMART goals because I don't like the R part, which is realistic. If they're realistic, then they're probably not a goal worth striving for. I really like the whole concept of actually doing a big, scary, hairy goal. Like make something that's huge. The only reason people don't do that is because they're so scared of not actually making that goal. I myself am a victim of that as well. But then what you do is once you have that massive goal, that big dream, is actually start to break it down into smaller pieces. And that's the part that people really struggle with. So if you've got a goal that's going to be, it could be, own a house, which seems probably nearly impossible in Auckland for a young person at the moment, but thinking about, well, what does that look like for me in 15 years? So in 10 years time, what does that look like? Where do I need to be at? In 5 years time, what does that look like? In 2 years time, what does that look like? In 1 year's time, what does that look like? And then you can break it down even further. And especially what I say about with your goals is make them holistic. So don't just put all your eggs in one basket. Really see if you can spread it out a little bit more. So you're not completely putting all your self-worth and focus on one particular thing. I think people actually do better. And it doesn't mean that you don't prioritize that one big thing. It's just that you've got some other stuff going on around you as well. The second part to that is think about your internal roadblocks. So if you've done the work on understanding who you are in the red mind and understanding your fears, then you can actually plan how you'd move through these. So if I had this particular roadblock, well, these are the potential roadblocks I see getting in my way. How do I think I'd get around those? So even starting to plan some of that out becomes important. Again, people tend to think that the road is pretty smooth sailing. You ask anyone, it's never smooth sailing, but actually what you can do is you can motivate yourself by going, okay, cool. Like if this particular thing happens, then I know I can go to this person, or I can do that, or I can think about it this way, or I can go that way. And this is a pretty cool concept. So arrange yourself a board meeting with key support people. So you can't do things on your own. I think that becomes very difficult. Some people can, but I think you make it significantly more difficult if you don't. So actually, if you're a young person, get yourself a mentor. You'll be surprised who will actually sit down and mentor you. Think about like if you're playing sport, your coaches, your parents, and we've got coaches in there twice, sorry, a teacher, or even like a psych or a counselor. So a lot of you at school have access to a counselor, but most of you won't go to them because you think, actually, I've got to have something wrong with my head or something wrong with me before I go to them. They're actually a really good source of information who know a heck of a lot. So going and speaking to them about, this is my big, hairy, scary goal. This is my dream. How do you think I could get there? And so have a bit of so if you think about 3 or 4 people that you can have on your side, helping you move towards that goal, thinking about, well, actually, I'm going to get them together and I'm going to meet them. And actually what I'm going to do, I hope it's next, is present your plan. Present your plan back to them and actually discuss in depth and be prepared to get some feedback on what it is. So if your goal is to be an all white, if your goal is to be an all black, or if your goal is to be a doctor, really think about what your plan is, okay? And discuss it in depth with those people around you, okay? Because they're the people that can help you. Then I reckon lock in some future review dates. So I know this actually sounds like a business plan, but you'd be surprised the amount of people that are starting to do this and how well they stay on track. So lock it. So say in a month's time or 2 months' time, I actually want to sit back and I'm going to talk to my coach about where I'm at, what the roadblocks I've had and how I've got through them. I think this is particularly important for parents, is actually start to talk about what's helpful versus unhelpful. And we never really sit down and say to our supports, this is what you do that's actually really helpful for me and increases my motivation, makes me feel good about what I do. But also, this is what you sometimes do that's really unhelpful for me. Actually, can we try and park that a little bit? And it also gives you guys the opportunity to discuss, well, this is why I do these things. Okay. And then have clarity and reinforcement along the way. So with some of those future review dates, having a bit of clarity along the way and reinforcing that becomes really important. I'm going to talk about that in a second. I absolutely know I'm going to go over time. I reckon, team, if you can spare me another 5 to 7 minutes, I'd love to just spend this time finishing this up. Feel free if you have to jump off, that's cool. So I'm just coming back to this point, have clarity and reinforcement along the way. So I talk about reinforcing the positive stuff. So this is a story about my daughter when she was 2.5 years old. So her name's Sienna. She wanted to learn to spell her name. I said, let's just start with S. And it was a little bit of a behavioral experiment from a psych. So please keep that in mind. So she drew this. At the time, obviously, I didn't know. So I've had to redraw this and I don't know what you call it, re-show you what it kind of was like. So basically she drew this and I said, that bottom part of the S doesn't curl around like the other one. You need to do it again. So she did it again, obviously tried to curl around. I said, that's not good enough. So you can see there that that's not curling around. And obviously you do that to a 2.5-year-old and they go off and they sulk. Rightly so. What a terrible parent I was. But again, what I'm trying to highlight is when you're doing that, yes, you are helping them because you're helping them see what they're meant to be doing, but you're actually decreasing their confidence. Okay, so after bribing her with Skittles and marshmallows, I got her back. And my feedback this time was that semicircle there is the best semicircle I've ever seen. Look at that, you've done that again. It's even improved because I can see it starting to go around more. There we go, starting to curl around a little bit more. Well done, Sienna. It's awesome. And again, you've done it really well. And then she nailed it on the 5th time. Okay, so sometimes what it does is it does take a little bit longer. And us as parents, and even if you're a coach, it's really easy because the brain is wired to see the negative stuff first. It's really easy to pick up on the stuff that people are not doing. But as a youth, you know yourselves that you're probably already being the most critical on yourselves anyway. You don't need someone else coming in and telling you that's not what you're doing. Okay, but it's not also about just seeing all the positive stuff and this is what you're doing well. It's also focusing on the things that you're improving on. And I think people get that muddled up a little bit. So I don't need to focus on the negatives, so therefore I have to focus on the positives. No, you don't. You can also focus on the things that you're improving on. So this is where I have my silly little milk analogy for reflections, which milk with a K is strong for your bones and milk with a C is strong for your mind. And so what this basically stands for, when you're doing your own reflections of your day, a game, anything, even around the dinner table, because most of you parents will know, you ask your kids, oh, how was your day today? They're going to go, that's good. Or you'll get a grunt. But if you ask them, like, what was your best memory? Or what was the thing that gave you the biggest smile? Or GBM's goosebump moment. In the game, we do have that goosebump moment. We're like, whoa, far out, this is bloody cool. They're going to answer you a bit more, right? So that's even a reflection for you guys as youths as well. What was my best memory? Where did I notice myself improve? So where did you notice yourself slightly improve, even if it's just a little bit? The best athletes in my mind in the world are able to reflect that no matter if the training was rubbish, they were able to improve in something very small. It doesn't matter, but they'll find something. And it does mean you have to work a little bit hard and search for it. Ella's learned. So what did you learn about yourself? Again, it's that understand yourself part. What did you learn about your mind? Or what did you learn about your teammates or your skill set? Or what did you learn at school? And C, so I bring in the courage part. Where did you in your game today demonstrate a bit of courage? Where at school did you show a bit of courage? Okay, and again, it doesn't have to be big, but it's just a lot better than going, what did you do well today? What did you not do so well today? I tend to find people that will stick at this for a lot longer. And I prefer people to journal little and often, rather than actually trying to write big massive amounts. Okay, so just a little tip there. And again, that's a tip for your students for reflection yourselves, but also for parents to actually be asking some of these questions or a variation of these questions. So this is the practical tips there is, for your students. Set yourself some scary goals. You can still do SMART goals. I was being a bit cynical, but you can still do SMART goals. But set some really scary ones. I think that's pretty cool. That's what's going to motivate us. And then actually breaking down those steps into really small things, even if it gets right down to the weeks, that becomes pretty cool. Get yourselves a mentor if you can. That becomes really important. And that can be simply like a coach and asking a coach just to spend a little bit of extra time with you. It could be an uncle or one of your parents, like best mates. Doesn't always have to be someone way out there. And please, please, please do reflect. There's a lot of literature around journaling and how good it is. And it doesn't have to be big, long pieces of writing. Literally, it can be the milk stuff if you want to. But you're not going to learn if you're not reflecting on, your day or your week or your game. You're going to become pretty stagnant pretty soon, okay? And what that can do is when you do reflect on your day or a game or a race or whatever, a performance, it can set up what your intention is for like the next game or the next training session. And for parents, again, I just highlight how important the environment is, where you can motivate via those positives and those improvements. So it might be that a routine becomes sitting down on a Sunday night and just going, okay, like what are some of the things that you're working on this week, or what are some of the good things this week that started to happen? But again, if you know that if your child has that plan, then relate it to that plan. That's that congruency that I'm talking about. It doesn't become kind of airy fairy questions as well. So it needs to be related to their plan and where they're wanting to go. And if they don't quite know where they're going, that's all good. Then you come back to values in terms of what are the values are important. And I do really encourage people to start to think about that. The second part is role model challenge for yourself. I think a lot of students and kids, they respond so well to when they see that their parents are getting involved and challenging themselves and sharing those experience with their kids, even if that's like you to get up and you have to talk at a board meeting, or my woman brother-in-law bought me a jump off the sky tower, and I absolutely hate heights. But again, I kind of think that's a pretty cool thing to be able to talk to my kids about, and because I blab on about courage all the time, so they're pretty sick of it. But if dad doesn't keep on showing courage himself, then it kind of loses its fizz a bit. And the other part, which was interesting last time I spoke to you guys, but build in your own self-care routine. The amount of parents that just doing that really run down and struggling to look after themselves. You can't look after your kids if you're not looking after yourself, and you really do need to prioritize that. It becomes a question of like, I didn't have enough time. I didn't make enough time, and it's really being actually quite critical of the way that we think about ourselves. So really starting to look after yourself becomes extremely important. And I did not actually role model that well last time I spoke to you guys. And that's hopefully not the message that I wanted to send out, is like, just keep going, keep going. There is the time for that. We need that edge, as in green mind, but there's also some time where you need to actually be a little bit responsible. And sometimes the most courageous thing is to go, actually, I'm not feeling well and I can't do this tonight, which is what I should have done on reflection. So just a bit of a summary, and then if there's any questions at the end, I'm happy to answer those again. If you guys want to stick around, it's up to you. And so students, be curious about your minds, about yourself and your identity. Really delve into that. It doesn't have to be all fluffy stuff either. Look at that red mind, green mind, draw it up for yourself, stick it on your wall, and add to it as you go through your year. And for parents, just building those stronger relationships. Keep on working on the relationships. I cannot stress that enough. Sometimes it seems a bit silly to do that, but it does pay out in the long term, for sure. Students, be values-based and standards-driven. So I really hope that you can go away and think about, shit, what is actually important to me? Is courage important to me? Is kindness important to me? And one of the questions I will ask people is, this is a bit morbid, but if you were to die tomorrow and your tombstone was about to be put up, what are the 3 words that you would want used to describe you? And so even if you work backwards from that, then you can start to go, okay, well, this is kind of maybe how I want to live my life a little bit. And those values may change over time, and that's fine, but go, oh, actually, I want to be known as a kind person, or I want to be known as a person that works really hard, or is simply honest. Okay, so what does that look like for me this week? And then you can put that into your sport, and it becomes a controllable. And with parents, sorry, the other thought was enhance the values through the family and reward this. So set up a reward system. If you're paying your kids to do jobs for you around the house, I'd actually probably more suggest is pay them for when they decide that they want to show some of these values that are important to your family, and you'll be able to know what they look like in terms of behaviors. You can do token systems and things like that. At the stage with my kids, I can still do stickers on a reward chart, and that seems to work pretty well. Until actually my oldest daughter worked out that she can steal stickers from the cupboard and chuck them up herself, and all of a sudden she's got all these rewards. So that's part of that conditional love, is rewarding through values. For students, take ownership over your pathway, build a plan, please do. I think it's your life. Parents are there to help all the time. Sometimes we don't know how to do it in all the right ways. but be kind. But you do need to take some ownership and some accountability over where you want to go to build that plan as succinct as you possibly can. And have the parents just be really supportive and ask about the plan and how we're going and what some of the things I can do to help you with that a little bit more, even if it's taking them for a little bit of job experience or what have you. Is pretty cool. Or randomly emailing a psychologist to go, hey, my kid wants to be a psychologist. Can you talk to him? You never know when I might say yes. I've certainly done it a few times. And the fourth point, which I mainly see that with the parents, which is look after yourself. Actually, please have a self-care routine. It sounds a little bit cheesy and soft, but it is extremely important. And same with you students as well. Please look after yourselves. Know when to take some time out as well. Yeah, the best thing you can do, and there's a lot of literature around resilience and self-care. And it doesn't mean doing it all the time and slacking off, but certainly it's about learning about when you need to sit back and look after yourself. So that's me for tonight. I probably have a few questions that I can go through. Is that all right, Nick, if I go through those? Sorry, mate.
Yes, yeah.
I know I've got
it. There's not too many questions left.
Oh yeah, you can get, I'm happy for you guys to get the presentation. That's fine. That's Julia as well. I talked about encourage reflections, more motivated. Build a plan is a really good one, and keeping it quite succinct to the as much as you can to the here and now, and rewarding values-based behavior. Yeah, environments, about that. That's good.
We covered everything.
Anything in the chat? Yes, please. Okay.
That was for more to keep going.
Okay, well, that's all good. Yeah. Do you want me to? Does anyone want me to actually cover like the sleep stuff like briefly? It's. I mean, the easy answer to that, which it's really hard to answer that without knowing what's actually going on for the person that's sleeping. So sometimes I have like problems getting to sleep versus staying asleep. There's a difference there, and so the strategies are a little bit different. But the easy one is form a bit of a pre-bedtime routine to learn how to relax your body and your mind a little bit. And even simple things like a 10-minute worry journal, we call it, in sleep, which is like an hour and a half before you go to bed. It's just like write down all your worries and things that are going on in your mind, highlight some of the things that that you could think you can potentially solve and try and solve them right then and there, or make a plan for the next day. Because sometimes when we reflect, we only do it once our head hits the pillow rather than actually doing it proactively. So that's what I'll give there for that 2 minutes worth. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Dom. I really, really do enjoy listening to you. It's so interesting. It's so engaging. You've got so many awesome ideas, and it's real life examples as well. I love the cake example. That's a couple of times I've listened to that. So still get something out of it. And I think I really enjoyed about how it's important for our boys to understand themselves and think about positive past experiences. And also you mentioned some of those negatives, and then the triggers that come from that, to understand themselves better and be in the moment. So thank you very much for this evening. I really enjoyed it. If the parents got any feedback or anything like that, please send that through via email. I will email out the recording of this, and I'll also put it in the Green Stripe Blazer on Friday. So thank you for your attendance, and thank you, Dom, and everyone have a good evening.
No worries, mate.
Cheers.
I was just going to say, mate, I can also, if you want,